She is gone. A dramatic narrative narrated in the first person by Edouard Marchais. Part 1. The Divorce Papers. She left the papers on the breakfast table on New Year's Day. I remember the specific quality of that morning. The light through the tall windows of our house in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, the winter light that is not warm but is honest, falling across the white tablecloth, and the 2 coffee cups she had already set out before I came downstairs. Because she always set out 2 cups, even on the mornings I told her I would not be home for breakfast. 7 years of setting out 2 cups. 7 years of small preparations for a person who had never learned to appreciate the preparing. She was standing by the window when I came down, her back to me. She was wearing the red coat she had bought herself 6 months earlier, which I had noticed only because it was an unusual choice for her. She almost always wore grey or blue, and the red had registered as a deviation from a pattern I had been absorbing without consciously cataloguing. She was wearing it at 8 in the morning in our house, which meant she was leaving, which meant she had already decided. The papers were on the table beside the coffee cups. I saw my name at the top. The specific typography of a legal document, the formal weight of it. And underneath my name in handwriting, I recognized as hers the handwriting she had had since she was young, upright and clear, without being prissy, the handwriting of a person who respects the act of writing the word divorce. I picked up the document. I read it. She did not turn from the window. My name is Edouard Marchais. I am 34 years old. I run the family firm Marchais Immobilier, which my grandfather founded in 1967, and which I have managed since my father retired 6 years ago, with the specific and demanding efficiency of someone who has been trained since childhood to understand that the firm is the primary obligation, the thing around which all other things arrange themselves. I am good at what I do. I am precise and strategic, and I have grown the firm by 40% in the 6 years of my management. I have been told by people who deal with me professionally that I am impressive. I have been told by people who deal with me personally less flattering things. The woman at the window was my wife. Her name was Clara Fontaine before she married me, and Clara Marchais after, and she was the most patient person I had ever known, which I had spent 7 years treating as an inexhaustible resource rather than a quality that had its limits. I set the papers down. I said, "What is this?" She turned from the window. I had been looking at her back for so long in those years that I sometimes forgot what her face looked like when it was turned toward me. It was a face I had stopped seeing, which is one of the things that happens to people who live with someone they have decided to stop looking at. She said, "It is exactly what it looks like." She looked different. Not physically different in any dramatic way, but there was something about the quality of her presence in that moment that was different from the presence I was accustomed to, the quiet peripheral presence of a woman who had spent 7 years moving carefully around the edges of my life. She was in this moment fully in the center of the room. I said, "Clara." She said, "Edouard, I have been thinking about this for a very long time. I am asking you to read it and to make arrangements. I will stay through January. After that, I will go." She walked past me and up the stairs. I stood by the breakfast table with the papers in my hand and the 2 cups of coffee going cold, and looked at the place where she had been standing by the window. That was the beginning of the part of the story that I understand the least and carry the most. I want to tell it as honestly as I am capable of, which means I have to tell you who I was before I can tell you what I lost. Part 2. 7 years. I will tell you what I was in those 7 years, because I have spent the time since working to see it clearly, and seeing it clearly is the only thing I owe to her memory that is actually possible now. I was a man who had been taught very early and very thoroughly that feelings were inefficiencies. My father was a man of great professional capability and limited emotional range, not because he was cruel, but because he had been formed by a particular set of ideas about what a man of his position was supposed to be. And he had transmitted these ideas to me not through any explicit instruction, but through the daily example of a person who managed everything and expressed nothing. I had received this example and internalized it and called it strength, which is what people call things when they cannot yet see them clearly. Clara came into my life when I was 24. She was 22. She was studying art history at the Sorbonne, and she was doing part-time work at an auction house in the 8th arrondissement, where I had gone to evaluate a property adjacent to the building. She was cataloguing items in a back room, and I had gone into the wrong room, and she had looked up from her work and said, without any particular calculation, that I had the specific expression of a man who was in the wrong place and knew it. I had laughed. It was the kind of laugh that a person produces when they have been accurately seen, the laugh of recognition. It was the first time anyone had said something to me that landed as precise, and the precision of it had arrested me in a way that I did not know how to process. We had dinner that evening. She talked about what she found interesting, which was the way that objects carry history, the way a chair or a painting or a piece of jewelry accumulates the lives of the people who have owned it and becomes over time a record of those lives. She talked about this with the specific and unself-conscious intelligence of someone who is interested in things for their own sake rather than for what the interest produces. I had not encountered this quality often. Most people I knew were interested in things instrumentally. She was interested in things because they were interesting. I had pursued the relationship with the same systematic approach I applied to everything. I identified what I wanted, and I worked toward it, and I obtained it. We were together for 2 years, and then I proposed, and she accepted, and we married in a ceremony at the Church of Saint-Sulpice on a Saturday in June, and she wore a dress that was not white, but a soft, warm ivory that suited her in a way that white would not have. I had in the early years something that approached happiness. Not the performed happiness of a person who has obtained what they sought and is demonstrating satisfaction. Something more genuine. She was good company in the specific way that only certain people are good company, which is to say that she was interested in the world, and she was funny without performing it, and she was capable of silence that was not empty. She made the house feel inhabited in a way it had not felt before she was in it. And then I began to let the firm consume what should have been reserved for other things. Not dramatically, not with any single decision. Incrementally, in the specific way that incremental decisions accumulate into a pattern that, viewed from inside, always seems to have a good reason, and viewed from outside looks unmistakably like a choice. I began to work longer hours. This was necessary, or I told myself it was necessary. And in the early stages it genuinely was. The firm was growing, and growth requires attention. I came home later. I was present in the house less. When I was present, I was often not entirely there. With the specific partial presence of a person whose attention is divided between the room they are in and the thing they left at the office. Clara accommodated this. She was a person who accommodated things gracefully, not by suppressing her own needs, but by finding ways to fill the space that was available to her, rather than resenting the space that was not. She worked at the auction house. She later moved into her own consultancy. She had friends. She had her interests. She was not a person who required me for her entire existence, but she was my wife. And there is a level of absence that even the most self-sufficient person cannot absorb indefinitely without it becoming something, without the gap between what was promised and what is delivered becoming so large that the promise itself begins to feel like a fiction. I had not seen this gap widening because I had stopped looking, and the stopping of the looking was, I understand now, its own kind of choice. A choice to treat the relationship as something already established and therefore not requiring the daily attention that things which are genuinely established actually require more of, not less. She had been telling me in the language of a person who does not make scenes for several years. The language of a person who communicates through the texture of daily life rather than through confrontation. The meals that became simpler, then more elaborate, then simpler again. The evenings she stopped waiting up. The conversations that became shorter, more functional, stripped of the personal. The way she used to reach for my hand in restaurants and stopped, and I had not noticed when the reaching stopped because I was not paying attention. I had not noticed. And she had concluded eventually that I would never notice, and she had begun quietly and without announcing it to prepare to leave. Part 3, After the Papers. January in Paris has a specific quality that I have never been able to like and have now permanently associated with the worst month of my life. The grey is not the honest grey of November or the brisk grey of early spring. It is a relentless, flattening grey that presses down on the city and removes any illusion that things might be about to improve. Clara stayed in the house. We occupied it, as we had always occupied it, with the practiced spatial awareness of two people who have learned to move around each other without touching, except that now the practiced quality of it was not neutral. It had weight. The weight of a thing that is ending and knows it is ending. I tried to talk to her, not in the ways I should have tried, not with the honesty that the situation required, but in the ways I knew, which were the wrong ways. I tried to manage the situation. I presented arguments. I raised practical objections. I said things about the firm, about our life together, about the logistics of separation, as though Clara were a business problem that could be resolved with sufficient analytical attention. She listened to all of it with the patience she had always had. Then she said once very clearly, "Edouard, I am not negotiating. I am telling you something that is already decided." I did not understand what she was telling me, not because the words were unclear, because understanding it would have required me to see myself, and I had spent 7 years deliberately not seeing myself, and the habit was too ingrained to be undone in a month. My friend Vincent Darras came to the house in the second week of January. He was the only person I had told, not because I trusted him more than others, but because he called at the moment I was sitting in my study at midnight with a glass of Burgundy. I had not drunk, which is the kind of visibility that tells the truth about a person's state more accurately than anything they could say. Vincent sat in my study and looked at me for a while and said, "What happened?" I told him. The papers, the conversation, the month of occupying the house together in its particular weighted way. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Edouard, I am going to say something, and I need you to actually hear it." I said, "Say it." He said, "You have been treating Clara as furniture for years, not cruelly, not obviously, but as something that was simply there, part of the arrangement of your life, that did not require attention because it was not going anywhere. She is going somewhere. And the reason she is going somewhere is that you have given her no reason to stay." I said, "That is not fair." He said, "No, it is not fair to her. That is my point." I sat with this. It was the most direct thing anyone had said to me about my marriage, and I sat with it in the way that people sit with accurate things in the specific discomfort of recognition. I said, "What do I do?" He said, "I do not know. But I think it starts with understanding what you actually feel, which requires feeling it, which is something you have not done in a long time." He left. I sat in the study until 3 in the morning with the glass of Burgundy I still had not drunk, and I tried to do the thing he had named, to understand what I actually felt. What I found when I looked was not what I had expected. I had expected to find something manageable. The specific, organized landscape of a person who processes everything efficiently. Instead, I found something else. Something I did not have a name for. A specific interior quality that resembled what I understood grief to be, except that the person I was grieving was still in the house above me, sleeping in the room that had been hers for 7 years. I sat with this until the grey January light came through the window. Then I went upstairs. I knocked on her door. She opened it after a moment in the robe she wore in the mornings, with the look of someone who has been woken but is not alarmed. She waited. I said, "Clara, I need to tell you something." She said, "All right." I said, "I have not seen you. For a long time I have not seen you, and I am telling you this not to ask you to stay, because I understand that the decision is made, and I am not going to argue with it anymore. I am telling you because you deserve to hear it said plainly, and because I have never said it before, and because saying it now is the only honest thing I can offer you." She looked at me for a long time. Her face was the face I had been not seeing for years, the face I was now looking at with the specific, desperate attention of someone who understands they are running out of time. She said, "I know you see it now." She said, "I am sorry it is now." She closed the door softly. I stood in the corridor for a moment and then went back downstairs, and the January light came through the windows, and the coffee sat cold on the table. And outside, Paris continued with its relentless grey. Part 4, the diagnosis. Clara left the house on the last day of January. She had arranged to stay with her closest friend, a woman named Sophie Vernet, while she finalized the arrangements for an apartment she was taking in the 5th arrondissement. She had managed all of this with the quiet competence she brought to everything, and the arrangements were complete and practical and left nothing undecided. She had a key made for the house in the 16th, which she gave back to me at the door. She had a small amount of luggage. She said she would come back for the rest at a time we would arrange. She did not cry, and I did not cry, and we stood in the doorway on the last day of January with the grey Paris morning around us, and I said, "Clara." She said, "I know." I said, "I am going to be better. I know it is too late, but I am going to be different." She said, "I know you mean that." Then she walked down the steps and into the car that Sophie had sent for her, and I stood at the door until the car turned the corner and was gone. I went back inside. The house was the same house it had been an hour before. The same rooms, the same furniture, the same arrangement of everything she had curated over 7 years, with the attention she brought to visual things. The art on the walls which she had chosen carefully and which I had never looked at. The arrangement of the books on the shelves in my study, which she had reorganized twice, and which I had not noticed either time. The specific quality of the light in the kitchen at certain hours, which she had found when she first moved in, and which she had mentioned to me once, and which I had not registered as something that mattered. All of it was still here, she was not. I learned about the diagnosis 3 weeks later. Sophie called me. She called from a number I recognized but did not have saved, and she introduced herself, and I knew who she was, and I understood from the quality of her voice, which was the voice of someone who has steeled themselves for a difficult call, that something significant was about to be said. She said, "Clara is in the hospital. She has been admitted to the oncology unit at the Hôpital Lariboisière." I sat down. The word oncology landed with the specific weight of words that changed the shape of everything after them. Sophie said, "She has known about this for some time. She asked me not to tell you when she left the house. She is asking me now because the situation has changed in the last week, and I felt you should know regardless of what she wants." I said, "How long has she known?" Sophie said, "Since November." November. 2 months before the papers on the breakfast table. She had known for 2 months before she asked me for the divorce, which meant the divorce and the diagnosis were not separate events but related ones, and the relationship between them, when I understood it, was one of the worst things I have ever had to comprehend. She had not wanted to stay because of illness. She had not wanted the marriage to continue because she was dying and had nothing else. She had wanted, in the time that remained, to be free of something that had cost her too much already. And she had managed the leaving and the illness simultaneously alone without telling me, because she had learned over 7 years not to rely on me for the things that mattered. I drove to the hospital. I did not call first. Sophie had not told me not to come, and I was going to come, and the call ahead seemed like a delay I could not afford. She was in a room on the 4th floor. When I came in, she looked at me with the expression of someone who expected this and had not entirely decided whether it was welcome. I sat down in the chair beside her bed. I did not say anything for a moment. She said, "Sophie called you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I told her not to." I said, "I know." She said, "Edouard, I do not want this to become something that it is not. I am not going to die tomorrow. I may not die at all. The doctors have not said that. What I am is ill, and I am being treated, and I am managing." I said, "You are managing alone." She said, "Yes, that is what I prefer." I said, "I know that is what you prefer. I know why you prefer it. I am not going to pretend otherwise." She was quiet. I said, "I am asking you to let me be here, not instead of Sophie. Not in the way I should have been here for 7 years, which I cannot retrofit. Just here in whatever way is useful." She looked at me for a long time. Her face was tired. Not the tiredness of someone who has been ill for a long time. The specific tiredness of someone who has been managing something large alone, and who is in this moment considering the possibility of not managing it entirely alone. She said, "You can come on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Those are the treatment days. Sophie comes the other days." I said, "All right." She said, "Edward, this is not reconciliation." I said, "I know, I am not asking for that." She said, "Then all right." I left the hospital in the early evening. The Paris evening was doing its January thing, dark by 5, the streets lit with the particular warm artificiality of a city that compensates for the absence of daylight with electricity. I walked for a long time before I got in my car. I thought about November, about what she had been carrying in November alone while I was at the office until midnight, and at the New Year's Eve party where my family had gathered, and where she had appeared for an hour in a dress I did not notice, and had spoken to my mother and my sister with the quality she always had with them, warm and present, and giving nothing away. And I had not thought about why she was leaving early, or where she was going, or how she had looked when she came in. I had not thought about any of it, and she had carried all of it. Part 5, Tuesdays and Thursdays. The Tuesdays and Thursdays began. I reorganized my schedule around them without telling anyone at the firm why, because the reorganization required more explanation than I was prepared to give. The first Tuesday was the most difficult. I arrived at the hospital at the time she had specified, which was 9 in the morning, and I brought coffee from the place on the street below that she had mentioned liking. She looked at the coffee and then at me and said, "You remembered." I said, "You mentioned it twice. Once in October, and once when we were in that neighborhood for a dinner last spring." She said, "I did not think you were listening." I said I was not listening the way I should have been, but I heard things. She accepted the coffee. We sat in the treatment room, which had the specific quality of hospital spaces where people spend long waiting hours, plastic chairs and fluorescent light, and the particular smell of an institution doing its best to be neutral. I sat beside her, and the treatment proceeded, and we talked sometimes and were quiet sometimes, and neither of us tried to make the situation into something it was not. I brought things, books, because she had always read, and the illness had not changed this. The specific newspaper she preferred, which I had not known she preferred until I asked Sophie, and Sophie told me, with the expression of someone who finds it remarkable, that I did not know. Food from places she liked, which I also had to learn through Sophie initially, and then through careful attention to what she actually ate versus what she left. She ate lightly, which I knew. She liked things that were not heavy, not rich, not elaborate. The food I had been served at home for 7 years in the form of the dinners she made, which I had consumed without comment, had been this food all along, all. I had eaten it without understanding it as an expression of her. I began to understand her in those months. Not all at once and not through any single revelation, but through the accumulated attention of Tuesdays and Thursdays and the occasional additional day when Sophie could not be there. I learned things I should have known in the first year of our marriage. The specific authors she returned to, the way she talked about the art she had worked with, the history she had accumulated in the objects she catalogued with the same specific unself-conscious intelligence that had arrested me when she was 22. The way she laughed, which was real and short and surprised out of her by things that were actually funny. The way she was silent when she was thinking, which was a different silence from the silence of someone who has nothing to say. Sophie observed this. She was at the hospital on other days, and she occasionally overlapped with my Tuesdays, and she watched the dynamic between Clara and me with the attentive care of someone who loves one of the people in the dynamic and is doing the specific moral accounting of whether to trust what she is seeing. She said to me once, standing in the corridor outside Clara's room, "You are different." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm not sure it is enough." I said, "I know that too." She said she is aware of it, the difference. She finds it painful. I said, "Why painful?" Sophie said, "Because it is what she wanted 7 years ago, and it is here now at the wrong time in the wrong context, and she cannot do anything with it." I stood in the hospital corridor and held this, the specific pain of a correct observation that cannot be argued with. She was right. The timing was wrong. The context was wrong. What I was bringing to those Tuesdays and Thursdays was the thing I should have been bringing to the ordinary days, the daily dinners, the evenings she had sat with her book while I was at my desk. And it had arrived too late, out of place, unable to be received in the way it would have been received if it had come when it should have. I said, I know I cannot change the timeline. I cannot give her back the 7 years. I can only give her the time that is here. Sophie looked at me for a moment. She said, that is the right answer. I am not sure it is a comfort, but it is the right answer. She went back into the room. I stood in the corridor for a moment and then followed. Part 6, what she said. There was a day in March, the 6th week of Tuesdays and Thursdays, when Clara talked about the marriage. We had not talked about it directly before then. We had talked around it in the way that people who have a large, difficult thing between them and who have decided sensibly not to make the difficult thing the center of every conversation talk around it. We talked about other things, and the other things were real, and the not talking about the marriage was also real, and the two of them coexisted without contradiction. On this particular Thursday, she was having a difficult day. The treatment had hit harder that week, and she was tired in a way that was deeper than the tiredness of previous weeks. She was lying back in the chair with her eyes half closed, and I had been sitting beside her for 2 hours without speaking, and had reached the point where the silence had become so substantial that it was almost a room of its own. She said, without opening her eyes, "Do you remember the first winter we were together?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You used to call me in the middle of the day, not for anything specific, just to tell me something you had seen or thought, something small." I said, "I remember." She said, "When did that stop?" I said, "I am not sure. Gradually." She said, "Yes, gradually. That is the word for it. It is the word for all of it. Gradually you were there less, and gradually I adjusted, and gradually the adjusting became the condition, and gradually I forgot what it was like before the gradually." I said nothing. She said, "I do not tell you this to make you feel worse than you already feel. I tell you because I have been thinking about it and I want to say it out loud to someone, and you are the right person to say it to." I said, "I'm listening." She said, "The thing I find hardest is that I do not think you were cruel. Cruel would have been easier to understand. You were simply not there. And the not being there was worse in some ways than something deliberate would have been, because it meant there was no clear thing to hold on to, no specific moment when things changed, no event to point at. It was just the gradual absence of the ordinary things that hold a life together." I said, "Clara." She said, I know you are sorry. I believe you are. I believed you were sorry that morning in January when you knocked on my door. But sorry is an odd word. It acknowledges something that cannot be undone without providing any practical function. I am not saying sorry is useless. I am saying I do not know what to do with it." I said, "Neither do I." She opened her eyes. She looked at me. We were in that moment as honest with each other as we had ever been, more honest than on our wedding day, or in any of the years of the marriage, because we had run out of the energy required to be anything other than honest. She said, "Edward, I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it correctly." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I am glad you are here now. The Tuesdays and Thursdays. I am glad of them, not because they make up for anything they do not, but because they are real and they are here and they are what is available, and I have learned to live in what is available rather than what should be." I said, "I am glad too." She said, "Good, that is the right thing." We sat in the plastic chairs in the fluorescent light, and the treatment continued, and we were quiet for a long time with all of it between us, the 7 years and the gradual and the Tuesdays and Thursdays, and the quiet had a quality that was not comfortable but was true, and true was enough. Part 7, the third person. I want to tell you about Isabelle Moret. She was a colleague, a senior architect at a firm with which Marché Immobilier had a long-standing business relationship. She was 32, 3 years younger than me. She was professional in all the ways that professional implies, And she was also, in the years of my marriage, someone with whom I had allowed a specific and limited intimacy of the professional kind. The intimacy of two people who work closely together and share the specific language of a field, and find in each other a quality of understanding that is not romantic, but is not entirely neutral either. I had told myself in the way that people in my position tell themselves things that it was nothing, that the dinners that ran later than they needed to, the conversations that moved into territory that was personal rather than professional, the specific quality of attention she brought to our interactions and that I had been bringing back to her, were simply the ordinary closeness of people who work well together. They were not nothing, they were not an affair, but they occupied a space in my attention that should have been occupied by my wife, and Clara had known this not from any specific evidence, but from the specific knowledge that a person accumulates about their partner when they are paying attention, which she was, and I was not. She had known about Isabel before she left. She told me this on a Thursday in April, not as an accusation. As a fact, she thought I should have. She said I knew about her. I want you to know I knew. I said there was nothing. She said I know there was nothing in the conventional sense. That was not the issue. The issue was where your attention was. I said, Clara. She said I am not angry about it. I am past the anger about it. I am telling you because I think you need to understand the full picture of what happened, and Isabel is part of the full picture. I said I ended any ambiguity in that situation in February. She said, I know, Sophie told me. I said, is there anything I should say? She said, no. I just needed you to know I knew, that I was not blind, that I chose for a long time to look away from it because the alternative was this, and this was frightening. But eventually I was more frightened of staying than of leaving. I said, I understand. She said, I know you do, now. She looked at her hands in her lap. She had beautiful hands which I had not noticed for years and had been noticing since February, with the desperate attention of someone recovering a thing they had not known was being lost. She said, Edward, I want to say something, and I want you to understand it is not theatrical. I said, say it. She said, I loved you very much for a long time, and I'm glad I did. It was worth it, even the cost of it. I do not want you to think otherwise. I sat in the plastic chair and felt the specific weight of a sentence that is true and complete and cannot be argued with. Not the past tense of it, which was painful. The entirety of it. The worth of it in her accounting. I said, I know I did not deserve it. She said, no, but I did not give it because you deserved it. I gave it because I had it to give. That is different. We were quiet. She said, I hope you learn that. I said, what? She said, that receiving something and deserving it are not the same thing, and that the receiving requires a form of attention that you are capable of. You are capable of it. You are doing it now. She closed her eyes. The treatment machine made its sounds. The March afternoon moved past the window. Part 8 April. She came home in April, not to the house in the 16th, to Sophie's apartment, which was large enough for two people if the two people were Clara and Sophie, who had been friends since they were 17 and had the specific domestic compatibility of people who have known each other that long and have learned each other's habits with the affectionate accuracy that only long friendship produces. The doctors were cautiously positive. The treatment was responding better than the initial prognosis had suggested. This is not the same as being well. It is a particular suspended state, the state of someone who is between outcomes, who cannot be certain of the direction of the thing, and must learn to inhabit the uncertainty rather than resolve it. She learned to inhabit it with the specific grace she brought to everything. She continued to work in a reduced capacity, advising on acquisitions for the auction house she had left full-time when she began the consultancy. She had coffee with Sophie every morning. She went to galleries on good days. She read in the afternoons. I was still coming, not on a fixed schedule now, but when it was welcome, which Sophie communicated to me through a practical and kind system of text messages that told me when Clara was well enough for company and what she felt like eating. This was one of the most generous things anyone had ever done for me. The transformation of Sophie's protectiveness into a practical mechanism for my continued presence in Clara's life. I brought things. Books. Food, occasionally flowers from the market near the house in the 16th, where the flower vendor had known Clara for years, and asked after her with the warmth of someone who has sold someone their flowers on enough occasions to feel a personal interest. I sat with her. I read to her sometimes when she was tired, and the reading required more effort than she had. I was bad at this, initially too fast, the wrong pacing, and she corrected me with the directness that had always been hers, and I adjusted, and eventually I was less bad at it, and we developed a specific rhythm of the reading that was ours. I learned things in April that I should have learned in the first year. The specific book she returned to, most often a collection of essays about the relationship between time and objects, the argument that things outlive the people who made them and carry those people forward in a form the people could not have anticipated. The specific author she found funniest, who was a French novelist I had never read, and whom she described with the affectionate contempt of someone who loves a thing too much to be objective about its flaws. The specific quality of her attention when she was genuinely interested in something which was different from her polite attention, a slight forward lean, and a stillness that meant the thing had her completely. I had been in the presence of these things for 7 years and had not seen any of them. I was seeing them now in the time that was available, which was not enough, but was what there was. Part 9. What Vincent said. Vincent came to see me in April. He came to the house in the 16th, which was an unusual choice, as Vincent had always preferred restaurants or his own apartment for our conversations. He came in and sat in the living room and looked at the room with the specific attention of someone who is looking for changes. He said, "Tell me about the Tuesdays and Thursdays." I told him. The hospital, Sophie, the conversations, the things I was learning. He listened without interrupting, which was not characteristic of him. He was a man who had opinions and expressed them readily, and the listening without expressing was the sign of something deliberate. When I finished, he said, "You are in love with her." I said, "I have always been in love with her." He said, "No, you always liked her. You valued her. You were comfortable with her. You are in love with her now." I sat with this. The distinction was precise, and it was true, and the truth of it was one of the harder things I had had to sit with in those months. I said yes. He said, "And she is not coming back." I said no. He said, "How are you managing that?" I said, "I am not. I am doing the Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I am doing the things that are available, and I am not managing the other part." He said, "The other part being?" I said, "The understanding that I have arrived at something too late for the arriving to change anything." He was quiet. He said, "Edward, I want to say something and I want you to hear it without arguing." I said, "Say it." He said, "What you are doing for her now is real. It is not making up for anything. It is not a transaction. It is simply real, and she can see that it is real, and that is worth something, even if it is not what either of you would have wanted the story to be." I said, "I know." He said, "People spend their whole lives not learning what you have learned in 4 months. That is not a consolation. It is just true." I said, "It does not help." He said, "No, it does not help, but it is true." We sat in the living room in the April light, which is kinder than January light, gentler, and we did not talk about it anymore. We talked about other things, the things that friends talk about when they have said what needed to be said, and are now simply sitting with each other in the aftermath. Before he left, he stood in the doorway and said, "She was the best thing in your life, and you did not know it." I said, "I know it now." He said, "Yes, now you know it." He left. I sat in the living room until the April light was gone and the room was dark, and then I got up and turned on the lamp and sat with the lamp and the dark outside the window and the specific interior landscape of a man who has understood something completely and too late. Part 10. The last month. The treatment continued through the spring and into the summer. The cautious positivity of April became more cautious in June, when the results from a new set of tests showed something the doctors described as a complication. I do not want to write the medical language of it, not because I do not understand it, but because the language reduces a person to a set of data, and Clara was not a set of data. What the summer was, the Tuesdays and Thursdays, the occasional additional days, Sophie's apartment with its books, and its good light, the specific quality of summer in Paris. that is unlike winter in the way that spring is unlike autumn, the warmth that sits in the stones of buildings and radiates in the evenings, the long light that lingers until 10 at night. Clara read a great deal. She went to one gallery opening in July, a small show by a photographer whose work she had followed for years. And she stood in the gallery in the specific way she stood in galleries, very still, giving each work the complete attention it deserved. And I stood beside her and watched her looking and thought, this is the whole of it. This is who she is. This is what I had and did not see. She said at the opening of one photograph in particular, a landscape, he has understood that the beautiful thing does not know it is being looked at. That is the whole of it. If it knew, it would change. I said, what does that mean for the person looking? She said it means the looking is a privilege. It means you are receiving something that is not offered. You have to be worthy of it. I thought about this for a long time. In August, she was too tired for galleries. She was too tired for much, and the apartment with Sophie and the books and the Tuesday and Thursday visits became the primary shape of her days. She did not complain about this. She did not perform acceptance, either the theatrical kind that announces itself. She simply inhabited what was there with the quality she had always had. The quality of a person who has decided to live in what is available rather than what should be. I came more often. Not because the situation had changed dramatically, but because Sophie said she asked for me on more days, and Sophie told me this without editorializing as a simple fact that required the appropriate response. I sat with her in the afternoons. I read to her more, now the books she chose, the essays about time and objects, the French novelist she loved with affectionate contempt. She fell asleep sometimes while I was reading, and I kept reading in a lower voice because the sound of it seemed to be part of what was useful. I do not know if this is true. I believe it. We did not talk much about the future in those months, not because it was forbidden or avoided, simply because the present was enough to attend to and the future was uncertain in ways that made speculation feel wasteful. We talked about what was here, the book, the light. Something Sophie had said that was funny. The photographer and his landscapes and the beautiful things that do not know they are being looked at. Part 11, December. She died on a Tuesday. I want to say this plainly because the plainness is the only form of respect I can offer it. She died on a Tuesday in December in Sophie's apartment with Sophie on one side and me on the other, and the Paris winter was doing its grey and honest work outside the window. She had been unconscious for the last hours. I do not know if she knew I was there. I believe she did in the way that I believe things without proof, because the alternative is to sit with the not knowing in a way that is too large for me, and because I think the body knows things the mind cannot confirm. Sophie held one hand, I held the other. The room was quiet. The December afternoon light did what December afternoon light does, withdrew early, leaving the room to the lamp by the bed and the specific warm quality of light that a lamp produces when the world outside is dark. At some point the machine made a different sound, the nurse came in, and then it was finished. Sophie and I sat in the room for a while after. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that was adequate, and we had both understood this for long enough that we did not attempt the inadequate. Eventually Sophie said she was ready. She told me last week that she was ready. I said, I know, Sophie said. She wanted me to tell you something. I said, tell me, Sophie said. She said to tell you that she was glad you came back, that the Tuesdays and Thursdays were a gift, that she did not need it to be anything other than what it was, and what it was enough. I sat with this for a long time. I said, is there more? Sophie said. She said to tell you that the looking was the whole of it, that you finally learned to look. She hoped you would keep looking. I put my hand over Clara's hand, which was still warm. I thought about the photographer in the gallery. The beautiful thing that does not know it is being looked at. The privilege of the looking, the worthiness it requires. I had learned to look. Too late in the conventional accounting, not too late in the accounting she had offered, which was different. which measured not the timeline but the quality of what was present. I sat with her hand in mine until Sophie gently suggested we should call the doctor. Then I went out into the December Paris street and stood in the cold for a long time. Part 12 after. 3 months after Clara died, Vincent came to the house in the 16th again. He sat in the same chair he had sat in April. He looked at the room, which I had not changed because changing it required a decision I had not yet been able to make. He said, "How are you?" I said, "I do not know. I am working, I am sleeping, I am here." He said, "That is enough for now." I said, "Sophie said something to me last week. She said Clara told her in the last weeks that the 7 years of marriage and the months of Tuesdays and Thursdays were a whole thing, that they could not be separated into the bad years and the good months, that they were one thing." Vincent said, "What do you think about that?" I said, "I think she was more generous than I deserved. I think she understood the whole of me in a way I never understood the whole of her. And I think the task of my life from this point forward is to become the person who would have deserved her, not because she is still here to receive it, but because she was right, that the looking was the whole of it. And I am going to keep looking." Vincent was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the right thing." I said, "It is the only thing." We sat in the living room of the house that had been hers and mine, and was now only mine, with all of her choices still on the walls and the shelves, the art she had selected, and the books arranged in her system, and the specific quality of light in the kitchen that she had found and named to me once, which I had not heard at the time, and which I had not forgotten since. She was gone. The room held her anyway. The beautiful thing that does not know it is being looked at. I sat in the room and looked at everything she had left. That is where I am. That is where I will continue to be. Epilogue. The Winter City. It is December again, a year since she died. I am in the street where Sophie's apartment building is. Not for any particular reason. Walking, which I do more now than I used to, the specific habit of a person who has discovered that movement in the city is a form of attention to the world, and that the attention is the thing she told me to keep. The Paris winter is doing what it does. Grey and honest and pressing down on the streets with the specific weight of a season that does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. The plane trees are bare, the river is high with December rain. The light lasts until 4 and then is gone. I am not going into the building. I am standing in the street for a moment, as I sometimes stand in streets that were hers. The gallery on the Rue de Bussy, where she went on good days, the flower vendor near the house in the 16th who asked after her, the hospital on the 4th floor where we had our Tuesdays and Thursdays. These places do not give me her back, but they hold something. They are the record of her presence, the traces she left in the specific locations of a life, and I walk through them with the attention she told me to keep, and I receive what is there to receive, and I continue. The photographer's beautiful things which do not know they are being looked at. The city which is full of them. I walk on. The December light does what December light does. The city continues. I am here. I am looking. End. She is Gone is an original dramatic narrative set in Paris, France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or to actual organizations or events, is entirely coincidental. Additional chapter: The House in February. After Clara left the house in January, I did something I had not done in 7 years. I walked through it. Not functionally, not with any purpose. I walked through every room, and I looked at everything with the attention I had not been applying. And what I found was the record of a person I had been living with without seeing. In the kitchen, the small chalkboard she had put on the wall in the 2nd year of our marriage, on which she wrote things. Not grocery lists, sentences. Sometimes a line from something she had been reading, sometimes an observation. I had walked past this chalkboard every morning for 5 years without looking at it. I stood in front of it now and read what was there. She had written in her upright, clear handwriting, "The most expensive thing in a room is often the thing no one notices." I stood in front of this sentence for a long time. In the living room, the paintings. She had chosen them over 7 years, replacing things I had owned before we married with things she found and wanted. I had accepted each replacement without comment because I had no strong opinion about the original things, and she always had reasons for what she chose that I did not ask about. I stood in the living room and looked at the 4 paintings she had chosen, really looked for the first time. The largest one was a landscape of field in autumn with a particular quality of late light, the kind of light that exists for 20 minutes before it becomes evening, and that she had apparently found important enough to hang in a place where she would see it every day. I looked at it for a long time. I thought about the photographer at the gallery opening in July. The beautiful thing that does not know it is being looked at. She had surrounded herself with beautiful things that did not know they were being looked at. She had lived inside a choice to pay attention every day, and she had made this choice independently of whether anyone else in the house was making it. In the study, the bookshelves, she had reorganized them twice, as I mentioned. I had not noticed either time. I looked at them now and saw that the organization was not random and was not the conventional organization by author or title. It was something more personal, the organization of someone who had been paying attention to the relationships between things. I spent an hour in the study trying to decode the system. I did not entirely succeed, but I understood enough to see that it was the product of a particular intelligence, the intelligence that looks at disparate things and finds the connections between them, the intelligence she had been applying to everything in the house for 7 years while I was looking at the office. I sat in my chair in the study, and I looked at the bookshelves she had organized, and I thought, there is an entire person here. There has been an entire person in this house for 7 years, and I treated her like a background condition. That was February, the worst and most necessary month of my life. Additional chapter, What Sophie Knew. Sophie Vernet has been Clara's closest friend since they met at 17 in their first year at the lycée on the Rue de Rennes, where they both studied, before going their separate directions at university. They had maintained their friendship across 2 universities, 2 cities, 3 apartments each, and the various relationships and professional changes of their 20s, with the specific durability of a friendship that has been tested enough to know it holds. Sophie knew everything, not because Clara told her everything, though she told her a great deal, but because Sophie is a person of extraordinary observational intelligence, the kind that accumulates information from sources the person being observed does not know are being read. She had known about the state of Clara and my marriage for years, had known it was deteriorating, had said what she could say within the constraints of what her friendship with Clara permitted her to say, and had been present through the leaving and the diagnosis and the Tuesdays and Thursdays, with the steady care of a person who has decided that being present is the primary obligation. She said to me once in May, standing in the kitchen of her apartment while I washed the dishes from a meal I had brought for the 3 of us, "You think I do not trust you." I said, "I think you are right to be cautious." She said, "I am not cautious. I am watching. There is a difference." I said, "What are you watching for?" She said, "Whether you are doing this for her or for yourself." I said, "Is that not the same thing?" She said, "No. Doing something for someone else requires a specific form of self-forgetting that is very difficult for people who have spent a long time not practicing it. You are learning. I am watching to see if the learning holds." I said, "What happens if it does not?" She said, "Then I ask you to come less often. Clara's comfort is more important than your process." I said, "I understand." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "It is holding for what it is worth. I did not expect it to, but it is." I said, "Thank you for telling me." She said, "Do not thank me. Keep doing it." She was right not to trust me immediately. She was also generous in telling me when the trust was developing. That is a form of intelligence I had not previously encountered and that I respect. At the funeral, which was in December at the same church of Saint-Sulpice where we had married Sophie, sat in the front row with Clara's family and did not cry during the service. She had the specific composure of someone who has done all the crying that was necessary over the preceding months and who arrives at the formal event already emptied out, carrying only the thing that remains after all the grief has moved through, which is love in its simplest and most permanent form. After the service, she came to where I was standing and she said, "She was glad you came back." I said, "I know, you told me." She said, "I am telling you again because I think you need to hear it more than once. And because it is true, and true things should be said as many times as the situation requires." I said, "Thank you, Sophie." She put her hand on my arm for a moment. Then she went to be with Clara's family who needed her. I stood in the churchyard in the December cold and watched the people who had loved Clara move around each other with the specific gravity of people in the aftermath of a loss. And I thought about the 7 years and the Tuesdays and Thursdays and the sentence on the chalkboard and the paintings she had chosen and the autumn light that lasts for 20 minutes before becoming evening. Additional chapter: the things she left. She did not leave a will, or rather the will she had was the standard form that all adults in France have by default, which left everything to her family. This was correct and appropriate, and I did not contest it in any way. But she had left some things for me, specifically small things gathered by Sophie, according to Clara's instructions, and given to me in the weeks after her death. The first was the chalkboard from the kitchen, which Sophie had unscrewed from the wall and wrapped carefully. The sentence was still on it, unchanged. "The most expensive thing in a room is often the thing no one notices." Sophie said Clara had asked for it to be taken down and kept, that she had said she did not want it going to someone who would not understand why it mattered. The second was the collection of essays she had returned to, most often the book about time and objects, with several pages marked by her particular system, which was a small folded corner of the page rather than a bookmark, and with several passages underlined in the light pencil she used for marking, which she could erase without damaging the book if she changed her mind about the passage, which she occasionally did. I read the underlined passages. Most of them were about the relationship between attention and preservation, the argument that the things we pay attention to outlive us in a specific way, that our attention is itself a form of mark-making, that to truly look at something is to leave a trace of yourself in it. One passage was marked twice with a double underline that was unusual for her. "The person who learns to look is the person who continues in some form in what they have looked at." I read this passage many times. The third thing Sophie gave me was a photograph, not framed, not formally presented. A small photograph taken on a phone, printed at a photo booth. Clara and I, in the first year of our marriage, at a street market somewhere I could not immediately place. She was laughing at something, the real laugh, unguarded and surprised out of her, and I was looking at her, actually looking at her. The specific quality of looking that I had spent 7 years not doing, but had apparently done once in the first year in a street market at a moment I did not remember. She had kept this photograph. She had kept it for 7 years and had asked Sophie to give it to me. I looked at it for a long time. The photograph as document. The record of a moment when I was doing the thing she needed me to do, the thing I had stopped doing and had learned to do again too late, the thing I would do for the rest of my life. I put the photograph on the desk in my study beside the chalkboard and the book with the underlined passages. They are there now. I look at them every day. Additional chapter: Isabelle. I want to say one more thing about Isabelle Moret, because incomplete accounts create incomplete understanding, and this account should be complete. I ended the ambiguity in February, as I told Clara. I sent Isabelle a message that was honest about what the ambiguity had been, and honest about why I was ending it, which meant being honest about my marriage and my wife, and the specific way I had allowed something to occupy space that should have been occupied differently. Isabelle responded with more grace than the situation required. She said she understood, and that the professional relationship could continue without complication. She said one other thing which I have thought about often. She said, "I think you knew before this that the space you were giving me was borrowed from somewhere else." I think we both knew. I am glad you are returning it. I read this and thought about what it means to borrow space from one person to give to another. Not in a grand or dramatic way, in the incremental daily way that the gradual happens. The attention that goes to the wrong place, not because of any single decision, but because of the accumulation of small choices to look in a certain direction and not another. Clara's word, the gradual. I had gradually given the space elsewhere, and gradually Clara had learned to not need the space, and gradually the not needing had become the evidence that the space was not necessary, and I had used this evidence to justify the giving of it elsewhere. A circular logic, a self-reinforcing blindness. I understand this now. The understanding has no practical application. It is simply the thing I know now that I did not know. And the knowing is the only inheritance I take from the 7 years and the Tuesdays and Thursdays together. Isabel and I continued to work together on several projects in the months that followed. She was professional and kind, and we did not discuss what had been between us again. The professional relationship was, in fact, good. It had always been good, which had been part of the problem. The way that genuinely good things can be used to justify the space they occupy, even when the space belongs somewhere else. She came to the memorial service. She stood at the back, and she left without speaking to me, which was the right choice, and I understood it as one. I saw her in the corridor outside the office a month later, and she said, "How are you?" I said, "Learning." She said, "Good." That was all. The professional relationship continued. It continues still. Some things, correctly returned to their proper size, can simply be what they are. Additional chapter learning to look. This is the last thing I want to say because it is the thing I carry forward. She told me to keep looking. Sophie delivered this to me as Clara's instruction, and I have understood it as exactly that, an instruction, a practical directive, the specific form of love that tells a person what to do rather than simply what is felt. I have been trying to follow it. I walk through the city more now, not with purpose always, sometimes just with attention. I have found that attention is a practice like any practice that improves with repetition and deteriorates with neglect. And I neglected it for many years, and I am now in the process of recovering it. I see things I did not see before. This sounds simple and is not. It is the specific education of a person who has learned that what they assumed was visible was not visible at all, because they were not paying attention, and who must now learn at 34 what a person should know how to do at 22. I am learning it slowly and imperfectly, and I am learning it. The flower vendor near the house in the 16th still asks after her. I tell him she is gone. He says he misses the way she chose, the way she always knew exactly what she wanted without hesitation. I say I know. I have started buying flowers from him on Saturdays, not because I particularly need them in the house, but because the choosing is a form of the looking. And I want to practice the looking in every form it takes. The chalkboard is in my study. The book with the underlined passages is on my desk. The photograph is between them. I look at all 3 of them every morning before I begin the day. The sentence on the chalkboard. The most expensive thing in a room is often the thing no one notices. I noticed too late. That is the cost of it, which I pay every day, which I will continue to pay, which is right. But I notice now. That is the part of it that is not about cost. That is the part she left me. The looking, I am keeping it.